Lesson 11. This lesson looks at Auschwitz and the end of the war, what happened to the Jews that survived the death camps, and what was the situation at the end of the war in April-May 1945. We'll begin sort of where we left off, looking at what was now becoming the central point of what was now the final solution for the Jewish people of Europe, according to the Nazis. And this had to do with the transfer of the majority of the work in the Holocaust to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Auschwitz is located about 250 kilometers southwest of Warsaw. In fact, it was created initially as a camp to hold Polish prisoners of war in 1940. Not only just Polish prisoners of war, but Polish undesirables, members of the intelligentsia, former members of the civil service and the government, and so on. By the late summer of 1941, the camp commandant, a man by the name of Rudolf Haas, was summoned to Berlin. Haas was told by Himmler at his meeting in Berlin that Auschwitz was to then become, at the end of Operation Reinhardt, the main center for the killing of the Jews. I always found Haas's reaction to this quite disturbing, as it wasn't overwhelmed by the nature of what the task he had to do. And I mean, Haas, based on the conditions of Auschwitz and what was going on there at the time, the fact that there were killings there, was a hardened mass murderer. However, it wasn't that he didn't really react to this in the way I don't know how you react to it, but he didn't react to it in a way that I find particularly human. He basically, his reaction to this is overwhelming delight. He's incredibly pleased at this particular moment to be singled out by Himmler and put his energies to the task. And we see a man who, due for naked self-promotion, takes upon the task of the extermination of an entire race of people with unbelievable effort. He starts to consider things and ways that the killing of millions of people perhaps could be done more efficiently. He looks at using carbon monoxide, but he considers carbon monoxide too slow. And it's not necessarily too slow in the killing process, it's too slow for the amount of killing he wants to do. And he starts to experiment with Zyklon B, and he orders some of his deputies to take a number of Soviet prisoners and execute them with effectively a pesticide known as Zyklon B, which kills the Soviet prisoners who are affected by it in about half the time that the carbon monoxide did. And it was basically decided at this point that Zyklon B would be used going forward. The main killing center at Auschwitz isn't at Auschwitz proper. It's actually about 3 kilometers away from the main Auschwitz camp at Birkenau. They chose Birkenau because there were 2 old cottages there. These 2 cottages could be blocked up and turned very easily into killing chambers. The bunker one, which came to be known, was in the first cottage, and it began to be used in 1942. This whole area at large was selected not necessarily because of its remoteness. It wasn't remote whatsoever. It was located to several well-populated villages, but it was very good, had very good connections by railway. And it seemed like a convenient place to send all of Europe's Jews. And it ends up growing into the largest Nazi labor and extermination camp of the Second World War. At its peak, Auschwitz housed 150,000 people, and that's apart from the people who were being gassed there by the thousands each day. And Auschwitz does consist of 3 main compounds. There's Auschwitz I, the original camp. There's Auschwitz II at Birkenau, that's the extermination camp. And there's Auschwitz III, which is an industrial center attached to the camp at Monowitz, which is just east of Auschwitz, which provided industrial goods and manufacturing for the SS primarily. Not to mention the fact that Auschwitz is surrounded by many well-known German industries. IG Farben, Krupp, for instance, all have camps and labor bases around which Auschwitz prisoners can be used. There were up to 100, give or take, not always continuously running, mini camps also around Auschwitz where laborers would be worked to death. The killing process at Auschwitz, more particularly at Birkenau, was slick and streamlined, very similar to what had happened at Treblinka. The people arrived near a platform. Eventually, a direct railway spur was built into the camp by 1944. An SS doctor would pull everybody off the train, give them a quick examination, wave a hand to decide who was fit and unfit, basically by looking at them. And the fit were sentenced to hard labor and death by another means. And the unfit, mainly the old, sick, children's mothers with young children, were sent immediately to Birkenau to be gassed. The numbers of fit and unfit and how the doctor made this decision generally fluctuated with the labor requirements at that particular time. So if there were a high demand for labor, there would be more fit, and vice versa. On average, only about 30% of the people who got off the trains were actually found fit for purpose and fit for work. The remaining 75 entered into the killing process. Once they were unloaded from trains, the unfit were trucked 3 kilometers away to Birkenau, and the killing process here somewhat fluctuated. Initially, the bunkers were sort of buildings. You'd go into one building where you would undress, you'd go into another area where your hair would be shorn and then taken out into what was then called the bathhouse or gas chamber. Eventually, by 1944, the Nazis had expanded the context. You would simply enter one building, and the whole entire process is in that building, which had as many as 4 killing centers with 6 gas chambers in it. Not to mention the fact that the crematorium was also attached. When they reached Birkenau, just as I sort of mentioned, people were undressed very quickly for a bath and herded into the gas chamber. Once the gas chambers were full, pellets of Zyklon B were dropped into the gas chamber and the doors and vents closed. Zyklon B is a heavier than air gas, which means that it sort of amasses on the floor, which means that the young, old, the feeble, the people who were less able to stand died first. Where the gas started to settle a bit stronger, and this is one of the more horrifying aspects. Realizing that the gas was on the floor, would try and climb over the mounds of dead bodies to get to the highest point to find the better air. It was futile. All would be dead within 20 minutes as the gas eventually expands to fill the entire chamber. An SS doctor would watch the entirety of the events through a peephole in the door, and then once he sees that everybody inside stopped moving or otherwise is dead, command would be given to switch on the ventilators. The Zyklon B would be pumped out of the gas chamber, and the Sonderkommando, the Jewish laborers, would be used to clear up the bodies. In the labor camps, those fit for work were taken to Auschwitz 1 or 3. Jews were a pretty significant percentage of the population, but the majority of people in the labor camps were non-Jews. Jews were sent to as many as 40 different camps or factories used for labor in some of the most famous German firms. And as I said, there was probably, in the time Auschwitz was running, about 100 in total, 40 given at running at any given time, including, as I said, some of the most famous German firms such as Siemens, Krupp, and IG Farben were utilizing the labor of the inmates at Auschwitz. Prisoners were identified in these labor camps by different markings or colors on their uniform. Jews, of course, were singled out to wear the Star of David, and because of the prominence of that Star of David, also they were singled out for horrendous treatment, particularly among the guards. But I'd be remiss to say that the other inmates, of course, were not completely innocent. In fact, some of the other inmates pointed out the Jews and persecuted them horribly. So you had sort of a double discrimination for those Jews who were sentenced in the labor camps. Of course, the inmates, all of them, were stripped of their identity and their self-respect. They were all fed watery soup. The general ration was an ounce, sometimes 2 ounces of bread, depending on the nature of work or the time of the year. Sanitary facilities were primitive, mostly, sometimes just consisting of a hole in the ground, which of course led to a widespread disease and so on and so forth. Every day you were awoken before dawn. There would be an hour-long roll call, sometimes counting up to 60,000 to 70,000 people on this roll. Brutal punishments awaited those who committed the smallest offense, or those who fell out of roll call, or those too weak to stand. Oftentimes they were shot on the spot, had the dog sicked on them. It's a horrendous thought. What's worse is that the fact that the Germans utilized some of the most hardened criminals to supervise the camps and the gas chambers. Most of the employers of German firms that used the labor adopted the mentality of the SS, and we have in Auschwitz an incredibly sadistic regime run by some of the worst individuals in Nazi Germany. Those that survived did so through luck and ingenuity. people who had sort of some longevity in the camp usually formed a friendship with an influential person, became useful to that person. You have stories of people who were good at the piano who stayed alive because they could entertain the SS at their parties and so on and so forth. But you basically forming a friendship, being ingenious in terms of the way you go about the sort of the twisted daily life of Auschwitz was basically crucial to your success and your ability to survive. Not to mention the fact that the mortality rates were off the charts. The camps themselves, even though they were used for labor, were not necessarily very effective economically. So many people died, and if you're doing something even remotely technical, much of it wasn't, you do have to train people up. And if the person who's doing that is dying every other day, it means that the ability for that machine, or whatever it happens to be, to function effectively is compromised by the mortality rate. So in many ways, the labor camps were that in name only. They weren't necessarily effective economic engines of the Third Reich, if you will. What's another well-known component of Auschwitz were the horrendous medical experiments that took place there. Many inmates were selected as guinea pigs for medical experiments. Himmler himself actually sends and selects a doctor by the name of Karl Klauberg. He was a leading gynecologist, and he was sent to Auschwitz first to direct a research program on mass sterilization. Sterilization had always been a component of Nazi racial philosophy, and sterilizing those who were sort of on the lower end of the Nazis' pyramid of racial hierarchy was a priority for the ideologically driven Himmler. Klauberg, when he gets to Auschwitz, of course, selects Jewish patients. Women first, of course, and he starts experimenting by injecting via needle, of course, without any sort of painkiller, chemicals directly into women's ovaries to test how well the chemicals destroy the reproductive functions of that woman. Men and women had and were subjected to massive doses of radiation, which burned their genitals. It castrated the men and caused their penises to fall off in some cases. And women had horrendous deformations, if not died from the massive radiation that they were exposed to, including, well, of course, naturally, radiation poisoning. The findings, interestingly enough, if you can even call them that, because these break all, obviously, codes of medical ethics, were actually even written, presented, and turned into scholarly documents, which were presented at medical meetings in Germany. Perhaps the most well-known and the most notorious of all of the doctors was Dr. Josef Mengele. And Mengele had doctorates in both medicine and philosophy. Mengele was a twisted individual, wounded on the Eastern Front, and he ends up at Auschwitz in 1943. He volunteers after his service in the Eastern Front is finished due to his wounds to end up at Auschwitz so he could pursue his research interest in the biology of racial differences. And Mengele is most famous for the person who did the experiments on twins, taking 1,500 sets of identical twins. One of the twins was used as a control, while the other was subjected to a range of medical experiments, chemical injections, experimental surgeries. Fewer than 200 survived the experiments of Josef Mengele. Many of these women, of course, especially women in the Mengele experiments, were raped very often as well. At Dachau, the prisoners were dumped into icy water just outside of Auschwitz. It's not the end of medical experiments. Were dumped into icy water to see how their bodies reacted and what could be done to revive them. Kept keeping them longer in water, almost to the point of death, and seeing if they can bring them back. Other prisoners are subjected to extreme pressure and decompression chambers to test the effects of high altitude. Most of these people died due to the pressure on their internal organs. I also feel I need to go into the situation with the Hungarian Jews because it sort of doesn't fit the European pattern to the same degree as the Jews who, I don't know, from Poland or the Netherlands or France for that matter. Hungarian Jews avoided the early part of the Holocaust. And what's important to note is that by the summer of 1944, most of the Jews in occupied Europe were dead, except those that were from Hungary. Admiral Horthy, who ran the Hungarian government, refused to send his Jews. He knew what was going on and refused to send his Jews, completely in defiance of Hitler. Hitler was willing to accept this up until a certain point, but by 1944 he would no longer tolerate Horthy's intransigence, and by 1944 Hitler actually sends troops into a quasi-invasion of Hungary. Hungary had joined the Nazi cause, basically acquiesced and joined the Nazi cause, but refused to take part in the sort of the Nazification of Hungary to the degree that had happened in, let's say, Austria, for instance, up until this particular point. Now, Hitler sends troops to Hungary, and basically they force Horthy aside and to make a more compliant government. Eichmann leads the German sort of diplomatic, I don't know what you want to call it, government takeover, if you will, and he arrives and immediately orders the ghettoization of Hungary's Jews into a large ghetto in Budapest. He will then, once the Jews are ghettoized and accounted for, he begins then the deportations to Auschwitz. Most of the Hungarian Jews who had avoided the Holocaust at this point end up in Auschwitz in May 1944 forward, and with the orders to kill, up to 12,000 a day are gassed. One of the, I guess, parts of this story that's important is you need to understand that they were killing so many Hungarian Jews in a wave and a level of killing of really unprecedented magnitude because of the sort of catch-up efforts as Eichmann had initiated. The smell of the burning bodies and the constant fires began to alert those people in the surrounding areas as to what was going on. It's actually really, really surprising that Auschwitz, at least in its purpose, had surprisingly gone pretty well unknown into the summer of 1944. But by the time that 700,000 Hungarian Jews had been murdered, Auschwitz is actually discovered. Horthy, because of his sort of influence in Hungary, orders an immediate end to the deportations once he realizes that the ultimate fate of the Jews are to be gassed and then cremated at Auschwitz. The Allies start to get their first real sense of what's going on here in 1944, having not known exactly what was happening at Auschwitz to this particular time, but at this point the word got out. Hitler, when Horthy refuses to deport more Jews, disposes of Horthy and sets up a puppet government, which then sent the remaining Jews to Auschwitz. So the story of Hungarian Jews is that of the rest. However, the sort of the late nature of this allows the sort of secret of Auschwitz to be exposed. At Theresienstadt, which is near Prague, Himmler, working under the conditions of imminent German defeat, began to intensify efforts to make Europe Jew-free. He started combing districts overlooked, and this included an area known as Theresienstadt near Prague. And Theresienstadt held in its ghetto approximately 140,000 privileged Jews, artists, intellectuals, World War I veterans, people singled out for being, I suppose, good Jews, if you will. And by 1935, once Himmler had combed Theresienstadt and sent these people off to Auschwitz primarily, only 17,320 were left alive of the 140,000 that had been left, had been found in the sweep of the summer and fall of 1944. The average killing rate of these people at Theresienstadt was about 1,000 a day when they eventually all arrived at Auschwitz. By the 2nd of November 1944, for reasons that are actually quite unknown at this particular time, Himmler orders an end to the further annihilation of the Jews. Most people assume that the labor shortage and the condition in the Eastern Front was so perilous that the needs of labor overtook the needs of making Europe Jew-free or racial priorities at this particular time. And the last transport arrives on Auschwitz on the 3rd of November 1944 for gassing. After which the gassing stopped, but the death did not. Of course, the conditions at Auschwitz didn't improve. The people died of all range of illness, torture, some were just shot, but nevertheless, the industrialized gassing stopped after the 2nd of November 1944. The Nazis will then go about trying to hide all traces of the killing that they did. They will destroy all of the gas chambers in the process, and if you ever go there, you'll realize the gas chambers aren't there anymore. By 17 January 1945, when the last roll call was counted at Auschwitz, there were 67,012 prisoners, which was less than half of what had been alive in the previous August of 1944. As the Soviets began to approach Auschwitz, the Nazis were pretty keen to move the people out of the camps, and the remaining Jews, all but 6,000, well, Jews and political prisoners, I should say, were sent. The 6,000 that were left behind were either too young or too ill to move. The journey for those that left was dreadful. There was little food given. If they fell behind, they were shot, and most of the Auschwitz inmates who were forced to walk to what is then the western part of Germany through a 16-week death march. Approximately only 280 survived. The Soviets entered Auschwitz on the 27th of January, and when they found it only 10 days after the Nazis had left, only 2,800 of the 6,000 that the Nazis had left were alive. They additionally found 836,255 women's coats and dresses, 368,820 men's suits, and 7 tons of human hair. And I think I had mentioned that the human hair was being used in the manufacture of socks. The number of deaths across the Holocaust, of course, and not only Auschwitz, are absolutely staggering. And how they died, of course, is horrifying in every way. Most Soviet Jews were shot on the Eastern Front. Most Polish Jews died in Operation Reinhardt at either Belzec, Sobibor, or Treblinka. Most of the rest of Europe's Jews died at Auschwitz. Amongst the other casualties, you see the list here on the right-hand side. There were 200,000 gypsies killed, 6,000 Jehovah's Witnesses, 40,000 criminals and asocials, 8,000 homosexuals, 10 million non-Jewish Poles and Russian civilians, and 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war. Foreign workers, 8 million foreign workers were employed in Germany to make up for Germans serving in the armed forces. Some came voluntarily from the Allies, from France or Italy. These people were treated, well, they were treated not as equal as Germans, but they were treated well enough. The Russians and Poles who were forced into labor suffered murderous conditions. Half of the people who were forced into labor in Germany were women, many of whom became abused and maltreated domestic servants. Most of these people were even isolated from ordinary German civilians. Some of them would be locked up at night, etc., etc. 100,000 Hungarian Jews were forced to build underground bunkers in 1944. Most of these died. The death marches that I talked about, his picture is an interesting one. There's very few pictures of these death marches, but this is a sneaky picture taken from somebody's window of what was happening, of inmates leaving Auschwitz and being, this was taken in East Germany, and near the border of Poland, and these people were being basically trying to walk them to the western part of Germany, places like Bergen-Belsen and so on. The Germans abandoned and cleared out their labor camps as the Soviets approached. In total, not just including Auschwitz, 1/3 of the 700,000 inmates across the entire concentration and death camp system were marched into the western part of Germany. 1/3 of these died, and 1/2 of that 1/3 were actually Jews. As I said, they died of shooting, disease, cold, exhaustion, and starvation. And the chaos in the final days may explain the incredibly high death rate, but also we need to consider that the guards who were forcing these people across Europe in this massive human migration were pretty loyal to their cause. They didn't let up in their sort of vindictive, sadistic behavior right down to the very end. So the death marches aren't just the people leaving Auschwitz. It's really important to talk about the people who are in prisoner of war camps and concentration camps and labor camps, and these people are being shifted all across Germany. The Auschwitz death rate was horrendous. Almost no one survived that death march, but the other death marches, which included large numbers of Jews, also had horrendously high death rates as well. The German camps, such as Dachau, and other non-concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen, were used as such from late 1904 to house Jews from the East, people who were marched on these death marches from the East to the West. The Jews there were systemically murdered, but many died were not systemically murdered, I should say, but many died as a result of brutality, starvation, and disease, so that Jews were not systemically murdered. The conditions, of course, towards the end of the war deteriorate as the German army collapses, as does their logistics lines and their ability just to function as a normal government country. And as such, the German army crumbles. The Allied soldiers, both the Soviets, Americans, and British, who were liberating these camps, were horrendously appalled at what they found. It would have forced oftentimes the local German populations to come in and see for themselves. So in conclusion, in 1945, Hitler committed suicide. At that point, the Nazis had been responsible for millions and millions of deaths. Only Jews and Gypsies of the millions who died were singled out for death in every town and village in German-dominated Europe. The exact numbers of those killed are only estimates and can never be known. Most of the killing that took place in 1942. Here's a real striking thing to consider. In March of 1942, 75% of all of the people who would become victims of the Holocaust were still alive. By March of 1943, under 25% of all victims clung on to some sort of meager life, meager strand of existence, in whatever horrendous condition they were put in. Hitler describes the killing of the Jews in his testament as the most significant work he bequeathed on the German people. And in fact, it's only in his last moments, in his last will and testament, does he ever really own up to his his responsibility for the Holocaust. And the fact that Hitler never really owns up to the Holocaust until his last days, and that, not to mention the fact that Himmler said the details were never to be written, could be proof of two interesting things to consider. Number one, either Hitler was uncertain about the reaction of the German people to what he was doing and therefore kept it off his sort of official notebook, or despite their anti-Semitism, perhaps they may have felt some unease about the morality of their actions, and that's something to consider as well. Either way, they both wrote, without question, easily the most horrendous chapter in human history, and a very difficult one for us to comprehend to this day.